So good morning. So thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be talking about shared spaces, Florida-friendly landscaping principles in your edible garden. And I'm really excited that Wilma is going to be speaking about those Florida-friendly principles. And she knows quite a bit about edibles too. So thank you for joining us. And Wilma Holly is our Florida-friendly landscaping specialist. Am I saying that correctly, Wilma?
Yeah. I always have to stop and think.
There's like six. And my name is Mindy Hannock, and I'm the Community and School Garden Coordinator. And we're both here at UF IFAS, Sarasota County Extension. So thank you for joining us this morning, and take it away, Wilma, whenever you're ready.
Okay, I guess I'm ready. Okay, so Florida-friendly landscaping is an integrated approach to maintaining an attractive and colorful and diverse yard, but a lot of people think it has to be one way or another way. It's not. There's a lot of different forms and styles that you can have, and most of them you're not going to find quite as manicured as this one that's in the picture, but they can be. They can be as varied as anything. I mean, they're really strange. The whole program for Florida-friendly landscaping was created in the mid-90s in the Tampa Bay area. I mean, Hillsborough, Pinellas, Manatee, Sarasota, Pasco, Polk County. I think they all kind of worked together. There was a lot of problems with the water, and you know, they just decided all of a sudden we really need to make improvements and protect the water. And then it became a statewide program. The whole state picked it up. It was such a good program that it became statewide. So it's just a really important to take care of our water. That was the main issue. But because our greatest natural resource is the water, and the misuse of fertilizers and pesticides can contribute to water pollution. It doesn't always necessarily cause it. A lot of people consider automatically that causes all the problems, and it does contribute, but it doesn't always cause it. Up to 60% of our fresh water is used on landscape irrigation, and with all that, you know, going back down into the aquifer, it can carry fertilizers and pesticides with it. So protecting our water is probably the most important part of our program. But it's other things included. They're all very much interrelated. So our population in Florida is expected to double by 2060. And keep your eye on this map here, because I'm going to click in just a minute, and you're going to see what all those red dots, how they've expanded by 2060. And there's going to be an increased demand for water. There's going to be increased pollution and decreased habitats. And those habitats are what filter the polluted runoff before it returns to the aquifer. So that is extremely important. And I'll look at that. That is what it is expected to look like in 2060. All those high population areas just get bigger and bigger and bigger. So in some counties, there's not much land at all left. So that, so these are the Florida friendly landscaping principles. There's 9 principles. They're all very much interrelated, but again, preserving the water quality is one of the most important ones. But they all put together, they all work together towards that. So I always like to show this picture because when we have a class in person, there can be 100 people in the classroom, and maybe only 1 or 2 are actually native Floridians. Everybody else has moved in from other places, including myself. So we come here thinking it's going to be all, you know, we can just go relax at the beach or hang a hammock in our yard or whatever. And then when we start working in the yard, it's a lot harder than we expected. But using our Florida friendly principles can make it a lot more relaxing and less work. So the right plant, right place is the cornerstone of the Florida friendly landscaping program. And plants that are selected for a specific site, if you do the right steps and follow the 9 principles, they're going to require less fertilizer, less water, and less pesticides, and usually less maintenance. We should have had maintenance as one of our principles. But thorough planning will help you place plants where its needs and yours are met.
So Wilma, can I'm going to interrupt you for a second. And so the one of the pictures a couple slides ago had a beautiful butterfly on it, and I think it was a parsley plant. And then, yep. And then the pictures on the other. Can you describe a little bit of some of the images?
Oh, okay. Well, this actually was a Christmas Day picture, and that was a chrysalis that had hatched in my house, and I released it, but there were already caterpillars out in the yard on the parsley. That's a host plant, and that's where the number 6 principle comes in, managing yard pests responsibly, because if you see the caterpillars eating your parsley or dill or rue, there's several different things that they do eat, and you go and spray them, then that caterpillar is what turns into this butterfly. So you gotta think of everything put together. It's a big web. It's not just one individual plant. If you're raising parsley just for using, then you need to have another, like a banker plant that you can put all the caterpillars on. It all works together. And the principles or the pictures in here, we have a bee on Nasturtium, same thing. Nasturtium can be used as an edible plant. The first time I tried nasturtium flower, I was outside, I'm like eating it, and I had to run in the house and get a drink of water because it was pretty spicy for me. I don't eat really hot food, so I'm like, wow. This other picture, when I first started putting in my yard 4 years ago, I had a lot of empty spaces. So in between the trees I planted vegetables, and that's part of what this edible gardening program is all about, is using available space. Now the trees and everything is bigger here. So like this year, I put everything in containers, and just that way I'm able to move them around. But here and there, I'll get empty spaces, and I always throw vegetables in those spaces.
Thank you.
So right plant for vegetables, the right plant, right place is really, really important, but also the right time. And your site factors are going to help determine the best site for whatever plant you're using. And the time of year does matter for the edibles. So that's one of the things that you have to think about, because if you're not from Florida or a warmer state, if you plant by the northern rules, you're planting in the middle of the summer, and they're not going to grow in the summer. And some, like the cabbage that's in this picture, won't grow at all in the summer. They need cool weather. So, and we do get cool enough weather for them, December, January, February. So you got to think about that a lot. And the watermelons, that was a winter crop. I think that was more like February, March, April. Okay, is it true that it all works together? I have not used any insects in my garden. It's still growing strong producing herbs, fruits, and vegetables. Yeah, you can. Thank you, Cheryl Ann. Yeah, it does really work together. A lot of people don't realize that and use pesticides, and then they're chasing away the beneficials, and that's something we will be talking about later on. And we just wanted to show you these charts. I know you can't read all the information on them. Well, you might be able to on your computers. If you were in a classroom, you wouldn't be able to. But this just, there's one of these charts available through the University of Florida for every single month. And it tells you North, Central, and South Florida, what you can grow during those months. What can be transplanted easily or carefully, easily survives transplanting, and then other ones that you should be using seeds for and not trying to transplant. So, and that's for each zone of the state. And like I said, there's one for every single month. Here's one for June, and you can see there's not near as much that you can grow anywhere in Florida in June, but some of them more than others. So site analysis, you need to determine what you have. If you have standing water, if you have sunshade, which way it's coming in from. The north side gets a lot of sun in the summer, but not in the winter. And I've had plants I put in front of my house because that's facing north, and they do really, really, really good in the winter, but in the summer they scorch a little bit. But then, I'm like, okay, I'm just going to leave you alone. You'll be okay. Come on, and then later they perk back up. But it would be better for the plants if I moved them somewhere else where they didn't get that much sun. So you want to determine all your things like your hardscape, your fences, your paths, your raised beds, place them in the best possible spot for your vegetable. Most of your vegetables want 6 to 8 hours of sun, but in the summer, some of the ones that you plant in the summer don't want quite as much. So depending on what you're planting and when you're planting it, you need to think of all those things. You want easy access to your water, because if you're having to drag a hose for 100 feet or whatever, you're not as apt to water it when it needs it. And also the accessibility to get into the garden. And like I said, the top one, standing water there's not a lot of vegetables that you want to plant in an area like that, but possibly you could build a raised bed there so it's higher, and it might be able to, excuse me, soak up some of the water from the base. But generally you wouldn't even think of putting something there, except for in your landscape, possibly plants, wax myrtle or something that can handle the extra water. And the bottom picture, Mindy, is that my garden? I can't remember.
That's what happens. So our community orchard, that's what kind of it happens when we're talking about like site analysis and things like that. If you're going to have encroachment from whether it's other landscape trees or if it's from invasive things like guinea grass, et cetera, just kind of evaluating that space, all those things that you were talking about. So then that way you have a good spot for what you're trying to grow. It's not competing too hard, or you're just adopting some of the extra maintenance.
Okay, and Gloria, we will be sending out a resource list with all of those websites and 100 more that will keep you busy for weeks. So there's some books in the list that we're sending out that you can download, and a lot of really, really good information. So we will send that out to everyone registered.
And for the gardening solutions, like if you're looking for UF related information in your browser, when you're searching a keyword, if you type in IFAS or EDIS, you'll usually get UF related material in return.
And then Dan, in those wet areas, said he filled it in with dirt and grass to minimize the ponding water. And yeah, you can do that. That's probably what most people would do.
Ooh, and if you're near our office too, you can also go check out the bioswale. They added a really nice signage explaining the bioswale out by our office to get ideas of what to do with areas where you retain water.
So soil and pH is really important for a lot of crops. So get your pH tested. Usually one of your extension offices can do that. There are extension offices in all 50 states, so it shouldn't have a problem, but you can also go to private labs for that. The best pH range for your vegetable garden on sandy soil is usually between 5.8 and 6.3. Most fruit trees are a little more flexible. But if you're having something like the blueberries showing in this picture right there, those want a low pH, much lower, more like 4.5 to 5.5 or something. So they like a lower pH. And then there's a link here for getting a soil test in Sarasota County. You can fill that out, and there's a form there. You can fill it out and bring it in, and usually takes about a week to get your results. And then there's a good video here. And like I said, these are all on the links that we're going to be sending out to you. So video for about soil and pH.
And I would say the soil video, it's actually an in-depth, like 2-hour-long talk from our the agriculture agent, really explaining soil pH and nutrients and organic matter. And so being that we have an hour and a half total with you today, we can't delve into that depth of talk of soil, so we will send that. that out to you. I wouldn't skip it. If you're trying to grow edibles in Florida, season and soil are key to understanding.
Right. And you also, when we were talking about the site conditions and everything, when you're considering it, if you're in a community garden or even school gardens, you want to be careful where you're placing stuff. You don't want a tall plant shading out a smaller plant. You would probably reverse the order so that the tall plant gets the sun, but the small one is in front of it so it gets sun too. So you got to think about all these things, height and width and all that. Okay, so you want a diversity of plants, even vegetables. If you had all one vegetable, say you love cauliflower and you plant your whole garden of cauliflower, then if you got a disease, you have a monoculture of cauliflower, it could wipe out your whole garden. If you have a variety, some tomatoes, some cauliflower, some broccoli, some herbs, some different things, maybe a fruit tree or something, it's going to be more interest and give you more edible options, but then you don't have a monoculture and it's not going to be as prone to a pest or a disease. Choose plants of obviously that are suitable to your space and ability. Sometimes you might think, oh, I want this and this and this and this. And then all of a sudden you've got this giant garden and you only have 1 hour after work or something like that. And you just can't maintain it. And then it becomes a chore and something that you can't stand anymore. And then you're not enjoying it. So you don't want to get too big. You want to label the plants in seeded areas, especially if you're using a shared space. But even for yourself, I always say, oh, I'm going to remember what it is. I hate labels standing around. I did that one summer and then I went on vacation and I said, well, I know what all these are. I'll remember. I went on vacation 2 weeks later. I came back and I couldn't remember where anything was or what the plants were or anything. So don't count on your memory, especially as you get to be my age. Anyway, and save seeds and share seeds with other people. Here in Sarasota County, we have a seed, what's that called, Mindy? You want to talk a little bit?
In our, at the extension office in our lobby, if you're coming in our lobby doors and look to your immediate right along the glass wall on your way to the restroom, there's, it looks like a card catalog, if you remember what those look like. And it has some seed packets in there. So if somebody is growing and they have extra seeds that they want to share, as long as it doesn't have to be edible, but it can't be invasive, understandably. And if you can mark on there what it is and when you harvested it, so then that way we have an idea of how long it's viable. So you can bring seeds to donate to other folks, especially the goal is that if you grew something in our area and it did well enough that you were able to get seeds from it, it might be something that does well for other people that live in a similar area. And then sometimes if I have leftover seeds from our school gardens and community gardens, then I put them in the seed library for other people to enjoy. So yes, and odds are if you're outside of our area, there's probably folks engaging in seed saving in your community too. It's just a matter of touching base, and social media sometimes is a good way to connect with other people with a similar interest or gardening clubs. And there was a question that came in, are fruit trees more flexible only for sandy soil out of all the types of soil in the garden? So, I mean, I would say when we're saying that information, it's in comparison to the vegetables people are growing here, where they tend to like a little bit of acidic soil, and some folks can run on the alkaline side, whereas a good chunk of the fruit trees that you can grow here have a little bit more, they can be a little bit more forgiving, but it's still good to look it up first, especially if you're going to invest in a tree and you want it to do well, because the pH and the drainage and things like that might matter. Like Wilma was talking about with the blueberry, those require a lower pH, and that's the case for some of the fruit trees. And then there's also, most of them require good drainage. There's an oddball here and there that can tolerate a little bit of sitting water now and again. So it's good to look it up just so that way, even within your own yard, you're putting it in the right spot. Same thing for cold tolerance. And I think we're going to talk about a little bit of that in a second.
Yeah, and these two pictures here, the one there was a young mango tree, so there was a lot of room around it while it was waiting to grow. Now it's like 4 times that size, but it so the gaillardias were just, I think they seeded down themselves and they just grew around it. In the bottom picture, cauliflower ready to pick, and then it looks like basil or something in the front. Oh. Oops, my pictures just went over my slide there. Okay. And then we wanted to mention invasive plants in this right plant, right place, because some of them might be edible, but they're still harmful to the local ecosystem. And there are, the IFAS has a IFAS assessment. You can just Google it by that instead of worrying about typing in the whole thing. And some of these, like the colocasia, the elephant ear, are considered invasive. So we don't recommend planting them. If you do, plant them in an area where you can control them so they're not escaping into a natural area. But the taro, the catleaf guava, there's a few other edible plants in Florida. And there's some that are on the caution list that you need to be careful of, especially like mangoes. They're on the caution list, so hopefully they'll never make it to the invasive list, but because it's a major crop in Florida. But anyways, so always check plants before you plant them. And this goes for any landscaping. You should always check a plant before you put it in. And I shouldn't tell on myself, but that's how we learn. We had some grass that we planted here at the extension office, and me and one of the master gardeners were at a local nursery, and we're, oh, these are really cute. So, well, let's put them in that. There's a garden around the drain. And without looking to find out what they were, I said, oh, I've never seen these before. I thought they were like a new introduction. So we put them in, and then we have another master gardener that's working on a plant cataloging all the plants and the locations. And he emails me and he said, these are invasive. Are they really there? And I go, oh no. I was kind of embarrassed because I tell people to check first, and here I hadn't checked. So always check first.
And that was one of the questions that came in was, does the caution list mean that it may become invasive? Like, what does that caution list mean?
Yeah, it could. It's been known to spread on its own, and they're watching it carefully. They usually reassess. Some plants they reassess every 10 years and some every 2 years. So it's just something you want to watch. It's okay to still now to plant it in your yard, but even yourself, you should watch it if you're seeing a whole bunch coming up all over the place. I've never seen a mango come up in my yard from the seeds. Of course, not too many seeds escape me. I haven't had enough mangoes produced. You know, I think I had like maybe 3 or 4 dozen this year, but they're getting eaten by me, except for the ones that the critters steal before I can get them. But
picture forthcoming.
Before they're right. So yeah, they could become invasive. So it's something you want to watch.
And then can you explain briefly, so the difference of this IFAS assessment, and then there's also the FLEPC,
Right.
and these are resources we're going to share with them.
To you as well. And FLEPC just changed their name, but I can't remember the new name. Invasive Species Council or something like that.
But the link is the same.
But the link still works either way, so you can still use the FLEPC link. FLEPC was Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council. Anyway, so the IFAS assessment is scientifically based. All research before they put any on there, they've researched them, they've tested them and stuff like that. The FLEPC is fairly scientific, but no research behind it, or not as much research behind it. So we always go by the IFAS assessment first because it's through the University of Florida, and that's who the extension offices in Florida Friendly Landscaping is through. But I kind of try to cross-reference things. If it's on one, a second, Dan, I'll get to your question. So if it's on one, I'm going to be wary of it looking on the other one and try to cross-reference before I plant something, because I don't want to plant something that may become invasive or it's on another list, because we're all in this together and we still want to work together with other organizations. Bamboo, all the running bamboos are invasive, but not most of the clumping ones.
So it would come down to variety. It's
Right.
good to know what variety you'd be planting and look that particular variety up. And then for the IFAS assessment, that's geographic. So it distinguishes a little bit if it's an issue in like South Florida, Central Florida, North Florida. So it kind of takes that into consideration too.
Right, because it's not the whole state, and FLEPC just puts it in the whole state. So thanks for mentioning that.
No problem.
And then we want to talk a little bit about, there's some plants that are really toxic and they can be confused with edible, or confused, you know, children might confuse them. Something like chaya is toxic if it's not cooked. So if you have a lot of children around, you want to be careful of planting those kinds of things. The velvet bean is toxic. Chives, garlic, onion are not good for dogs. So think about those things as well when you're planting.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean you can't grow them, but your placement would matter, which kind of goes back to that right plant, right place. So consider the mature size when you're choosing your plant. So the top photo is showing a loofah that was kind of planted on the far left of that picture on the inside of the fence. And then within within a summer or less, probably half a summer, it actually had grown and spread all the way down, and it would have kept going. So just consider the mature size. And then whereas like in the picture on the bottom, both of these are community gardens, but the picture on the bottom, the member was being cognizant of the fact that they're in a shared space and they can't crowd out their fellow members and crowd out light, et cetera. And so they actually had a similar type plant, but they had it growing out of the pots that you can see on the ground in the back. And then they had like kind of like a chain link fence tied to the posts. And so up out of the pot they grew and down those fence posts. And what I found really interesting was the one in the bottom picture, even though it's much smaller, it was in production. So they were able to harvest crop off of it. The one on the top, it was growing, but I never actually saw any loofah coming off that vine. So just kind of that goes into the considering the mature size, and it doesn't mean you can't grow certain things, but you might be able to get creative even if you're working within a smaller space. And then you're able to encourage like airflow, reduce pests and disease and things of that nature as well when you're considering some of those things.
Okay, so and then especially in landscapes, you're going to use ground cover where grass is difficult to grow or maintain, but in gardens you can, there are ground covers that are edible and things like that. So you're going to look at places like that, and you're not going to basically have grass in your edible garden anyways, unless you're using a lemongrass or something like that that is edible that you want to use. You want to group plants according to their water needs. That's called hydrozones. And in gardens, most vegetable plants want a little more water than your normal landscape plants. So you need to keep that in mind. If you have irrigation that's hitting other areas or it's hitting your garden, you want to keep that in mind too. And then keep in mind cold and heat tolerance. This picture on the bottom left was the first year I had all my trees in and all that, and we got a cold spell. And I'm bordering South Florida where I live in Northport, and you can see my mango tree suffered pretty heavily that year, and I think it's frozen once since then, but not as bad. But you can see all the cabbage and everything in there. They love cold weather, so it was perfect for them. But tomatoes and things like that, cucumber, squash, those all are gonna not handle the cold as well. So I did cover some stuff. I think I had actually covered the mango, but it didn't, it blew off. And you know, you got to think about those kinds of things. If you're planting a garden, fruit trees, anything that isn't cold tolerant, you want to think about that. And stuff like rosemary can handle, in the upper picture here, can handle the cold weather. Onions can handle the cold weather. And then this past year, the lettuce here and the pots, I have a really, rabbits love my garden. So I got creative and put it up where they couldn't reach it quite as easy. And then there's some tomatoes there behind that. I don't have as much space because everything's much bigger. This is that same mango tree here in the background on that bottom right. And Mindy, you want to talk about the zinnias?
Oh, that was just, that was along, that was inside someone's plot, right near the area where they had their fencing to kind of, in their attempts to keep the bunnies out. And so, you know, they wanted something there that looked pretty for their fellow members, but not something that they needed to really get their fingers, you know, too tight into to harvest regularly. So it, you know, it was something that it added something. It made you smile as you walk by, you know, but it wasn't something that they had to like reach in and tend and stuff like that. So, and I think that's one of the things you're kind of considering. So that was one of the questions. We did get a couple questions coming in about ground cover and also cover crops. So we can talk a little bit about that. And then forgive me, we might let a couple questions kind of pile up and get further into our slide presentations for the, just to be cognizant of our timing, and then we'll come back and answer some. So Wilma, do you want to give I can talk a little bit about cover crop or whatnot, but do you want to give a little bit of a description of, is there a definition of ground cover? I mean, I just consider it something short that covers the ground.
Yeah, that's kind of what I consider, usually what I consider ground cover is something that is going to crawl and cover a large area. But sometimes some plants they'll call ground covers that we don't really think of as ground covers. Like I've heard juniper called a ground cover because if you plant one and one another 3 feet away, they're going to reach each other, and then they're calling that a ground cover. But generally, I'm talking about a creeping thing. Yeah.
And so, and then that can kind of tie in with, like, say, for example, summer months, well, depending on the time of when they put them in, like your earlier picture that showed the watermelon,
Right.
You know, that as some of those crops fill in, I mean, it's serving as a ground cover. It's covering over the soil where it's going to help minimize some of the weeds that pop up. Same thing with like sweet potato. And stuff like that. And then some people will use like a sweet potato and work it back in as like a green manure. So in a way, it kind of like, whereas like, so cover crop, a lot of times, I think there's the implication also that it's going to have some benefit for the soil. Whereas ground cover, I think the implication is that it's covering the ground, but you can kind of.
And it's permanent. Yeah, ground covers are permanent usually. Although there are some vegetable ground covers that wouldn't necessarily be permanent because you're going to be eating them. But and then one thing I wanted to say about the center picture, flowers along a walkway, you do need to be careful if there are people around that are allergic to bees, because there's going to always be pollinators on there, and some of the pollinators are bees, and if you're walking through there you might bump into one and it might sting you. So you got to be careful with something like that, especially if it's a school or a community garden. In your own home, you know where you're walking and what you're doing and whether it bothers you or not. So that would be okay there. Okay. And then, whoops, we forgot to take out that. Oh, well.
I think it was just kind of a little bit more visual of like, yeah. The purpose and things of the ground covers and what happens if you don't do anything.
Yeah. And if you have a grass garden path, you do need to mow. You don't want to let it happen like this picture here where the whole garden is ended up being covered with grass and it's not being maintained. turf can be the right plant for some places as in an edible garden. Paths, the community gardens, I think sometimes use that. Myself, I would prefer a mulched, neater looking path, but if it was being mowed, then that would be okay. You want them to, turf areas to be functional and easy to maintain. It's going to be a little harder to maintain around these beds if you were maintaining. So that's another thing to consider. A small amount of turf can have a big impact when you're talking about curb appeal and design. For instance, this ornamental sweet potato here, you're going to have to edge along there because that will take over that whole area. But it adds some depth here to have some grass and then being separated, having the ground cover here in the bed. If you had that all one, it's not going to give you as much curb appeal. So you got to think about things like that as well. And you could just as easily plant an edible sweet potato in an area like that. If you have the space, it's pretty while it's growing, and then you harvest your crop, and then you could put in your ornamental or do something different, but you can always think of that.
Yeah, and I like that when you're talking about like the right plant, right place, and the aesthetic of it, because depending on where you're putting your edibles and how you're incorporating them, some people are just purely about function. They don't care what it looks like, and if it's their backyard, you know, that type of thing. Whereas if you're trying to sneak in some of your edibles, or keep it in a you know, in a certain way, because maybe you're gardening in your front yard and your side yard and all of that. And so like, here's another example. This is, they actually put in like a food forest, if you will. This was at, I think this is at Bay Haven, one of the elementary schools. And they incorporated, you know, there's different heights and textures and everything like that. And most of these are edible plants. And you can kind of see between the two buildings, they're not all going to be in full sun all day long, but they have enough sun to make it work.
And here on the left, there's just some more of my vegetables and herbs in between my trees while they were waiting to grow. The Nasturtium, again, they got giant that year, and I saved seeds, and I'm still having seeds. That was like 4 years ago. I'm still using seeds. You can see I have rabbits, and they like digging, and other critters that come in and dig. So, and then Mindy, you want to talk about this other picture?
The picture on the right is one of the plots in one of the community gardens, and they almost, they made like a little mini garden within their own plot. So in the front, and what you talked about earlier with like hydrozones and things of that. So they had some like Florida friendly, you know, blooming plants incorporated in with things like their rosemary in the front. That didn't need a lot of water. And then further back in, they had some of their edibles, and then they had the things that were going to get taller that they didn't want to have shade out. Their other plants, they had those staged in the back. And then they had pathways within their own plot so they could maneuver around. Because in the gardens, I would say, you know, there's some folks that do row plantings and stuff like that, but even in some of the bigger plots, I usually see a lot of people still incorporating some square foot gardening methods within their own plot. So they like to have ways to maneuver around. So, and then they kind of, you know, and then they decorated it and stuff like that. So I think sometimes people forget that you can be creative with your edible gardening just as much as you would with any of your other landscaping. And then the picture on the bottom, so the top picture is a before picture, and then the bottom picture is an after picture at the same elementary school. And I took these from one of the teachers has these available. He's a quite talented guy that's very good at doing mock-ups before they go out and do their work. And so his goal with that space was not only to be able to grow edibles, but to have certain things along that pathway. So even if there's students that don't get to participate in that garden on a daily basis, but they get to walk by it, there would be different textures. And then they kind of in some of those areas along the way, they plant some of the herbs. So that way there's like an aroma and textures and pollinators, different things like that. So as they walk by, even if they don't get to go fully into the space, they still get to appreciate and notice things. that are growing. So you can kind of see that picture above. It was an underutilized space, and then all the different types of diverse plants that are in the picture below. So I would say we're really fortunate in Florida. There's really a lot that grows here. It does take, you're gonna sweat some, but we really do have, if folks wanted to grow year round, they can. But there's just so many things that you can grow here. It's a wonderful thing.
Okay, so our second principle, efficient watering. There's a couple of key points. It's a little bit different with vegetable gardens and edibles than a general landscape, but you still want to utilize the water as efficiently as possible. As we said earlier, 60% of a residential water bill is attributed to irrigation systems. There's usually in vegetables gardens, you're going to be hand watering or micro or drip or bubblers, because you want it to get efficiently to the roots, and because you can water every day or every other day or whatever. Here in Sarasota County, we have 1 day a week watering, so you can't just turn on an irrigation system and let it run, because then you're going to get in trouble for watering when you're not supposed to. So that's why you would be using the hand watering or micro drip, because those are allowed all the time. But you do still want to group plants with similar water needs together and lighting needs, and have other plants. If you have plants that don't need any water, as Mindy mentioned in that one picture with the rosemary, needs very little water, and if you happen to be watering it every day, you're going to kill it. So you need to think about those things when you're planting. The university doesn't, this top picture here, this is a rain water storage device, and the university doesn't recommend using rainwater on vegetables and edibles, because you don't know what's coming off the roof, if there's any pathogens or anything in that water, especially, because birds are flying over, and you know what birds do when they fly over you. So, just that's not recommended for edibles, so don't use it. And then also reclaimed water on vegetables. You should use that for other areas of your landscape, flowers that you're not eating, anything like that, but not on your vegetables. So irrigating in the morning, early in the morning, like 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock or whatever, before the sun comes up, is better, because the winds are calmer, the temperatures are usually a little bit cooler, better water pressure. If you're applying water in the afternoon, 40 to 60% of it is going to evaporate. And in Sarasota County, there's no watering allowed between 10 and 4, 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. And then in the cooler months, where a lot of our gardens are in, not as much water is needed for the plants. So you want to check and maintain your system. Mulched beds are going to need less water. So all these things you're going to want to take into consideration, but you don't want to water late in the day, especially in the winter.
You're starting to freeze up a little, Wilma. Let's see here. Can you, I'm assuming if she's frozen for me, she might be frozen for everyone. Is that true if you put it in the chat?
The root system is going to dry out a lot faster, and then you're going to have problems with that. And it reduces the oxygen to the roots, and it causes stress. You have reduction in canopy coverage. And if you're seeing dollarweed in your garden or in your landscape, either one, that's an indication of overwatered lawn. Mindy,
yeah, Wilma, you froze for a brief moment. So if you can stay on the effects of overwatering and repeat the first sentence or two of the slide.
Okay. Yeah, I have an unstable internet connection. Go figure, I'm in the office. So
and I'm from home today. And
yours is good. Yeah. So overwatering, you're encouraging the growth of fungi and bacteria. That's the same with leaving it on overnight. It's going to encourage weed growth in your garden if you're overwatering, and you don't want that. Your root system's not going to be as deep. So, and that's not good because you want as strong and deep a root system as you have, and then you don't have to water as much. It's going to reduce oxygen to the roots, which causes stress and a reduction in the canopy coverage. And dollar weed is a huge indication of overwatering. So those are all things you want to consider. You want to watch the weather if yeah, the weather reports are hard to watch. They don't, I don't know, they're not too accurate sometimes. I looked at the weather report the other day, the radar, and it showed rain at my house and we didn't get any at all. So can't always go by that. But if you know, if it's really, really gonna rain, you can usually tell, or, you know, a little more accurate sometimes than others. But if it's looking like it's gonna rain, you don't want to be watering your garden or your yard or any of your landscape plants just before that. So try to watch, and especially if you're using the drip irrigation, you can turn it on later if it doesn't rain. If it's your yard, you know, you have to hedge your bets and you might need to water, but otherwise, but having a rain gauge is going to help you with knowing how much water you've actually had in the, you know, because sometimes you think it's raining pretty hard and you look and there's not that much. Like last night I had a little bit of rain at my house and I looked at the rain gauge and it was 4/10. So I had been thinking I need to go water some of my potted plants, but I didn't, and I was glad I didn't because they got enough water. So thinking about things like that, you can track it with that. And if you do have an automatic landscape irrigation system, a rain sensor is required by law in the state of Florida, and that's the whole state.
And I would say for school gardens too, the little weather, like having a little weather station out in the school garden, the kids enjoy that. And sometimes even if some of the classes go by, even if they don't get to engage with the garden on a regular basis, some of the teachers like to use that little weather station with their students as well. So they get a kick out of it and it's useful.
Okay. Oops, that one didn't I? And so we talked earlier about the pH tests. You also want to do a test for soils. You can send to the University of Florida and they give you they tell you what nutrients are in your soil, except for, I think it's nitrogen that is immobile or mobile, and it's not in there long enough to know, but they'll tell you what you need put in your garden, if you even need fertilizer at all. But you can also amend by adding organic matter and compost to help improve the soil. And if you're doing that, you may not end up needing to fertilize, but it's helpful to know what your soil test is, if it's really high or really low in something. And generally fertilizing a crop as needed, following label calculations, because sometimes if it's not showing any signs of needing fertilizer, and you usually can tell by yellow veins, a whole general sad looking plant, those are signs that you probably need some fertilizer. And never, ever, ever use a weed and feed fertilizer on your garden especially, but even in lawns, unless you have a giant lawn and you're not near any other plants, if you're near trees, that's considered a weed to that fertilizer. So weed and feed fertilizers around a vegetable garden would actually kill most of your garden. So,
and for the community gardens, they wouldn't be allowed to use that.
Yeah, because they have to use organic.
So,
anyway,
and then there's been a couple questions in the chat, so I just want to take a quick moment and catch up on those. Do we have one or two more slides on fertilize, and then we'll pop over to the questions?
Okay. In Florida, 50% or greater slow release nitrogen, and that's just a good general practice anyways. Like all these practices, especially in Florida friendly, are general practices, are good for your whole garden, they're good for your landscape. They thoroughly studied all this and came up with the best things that you can do. So that's why we have the program. So slow release nitrogen, and always follow the rules of the label directions, proper application and disposal, never fertilize within 10 feet of any water body. If you have a vegetable garden that's near a lake and you're using that lake water, always just make sure that if you fertilize, none of it's going into the water and it's at least 10 feet away. Vegetables are exempt from our fertilizer ordinances. Not all counties in Florida have them, but a lot of them do. Sarasota, I know we have people here from Pinellas and they have an ordinance. I believe Manatee County does. So a lot of our, especially along the coast, most of them do have ordinances. Using slow release fertilizers helps spread it out over a longer period of time, and use it in spring. In the winter, most of your slow release fertilizers just are tied up in cold weather. They're not being utilized as well anyways. And then you can use iron for green up, but that's more for landscape. And Mindy, you want to explain this picture here?
The lower picture is a canistel tree that was that's trying to grow in the orchard, and it was having an issue with nutrition and tied into pH issues as well. So so if we just applied fertilizer over and over and over again, it wouldn't have rectified the problem. So we had to amend, do a little bit to help with the pH. So then that way, when it is fertilized, it can actually take that nutrition up. That ties into one of the questions that kind of came in through chat, where somebody was asking about picking and choosing, I guess, maybe between soil and pH. And they're kind of, so say you're growing hydroponically and you're still going to be considering like pH scenarios, even though you're not growing in soil. But when you are growing in soil, like there's still pH and soil can be, hand in hand because it's the medium that you're growing in. So if you have a soil test done, even if you were to send soil away to UF, which I think you said you're in Virginia, so I wouldn't send your soil to us. I would send it to your state extension. Say we send our soil away to the state for like nutrition analysis, they're going to still incorporate like a pH result with that. Whereas if we take it to our county office, we can only run pH. We can't give the nutrient breakdown. But I'm going to send you a link in the chat for the Virginia extension service because you had also mentioned having clay soil and everything like that. So a lot of things that we're going to talk about can translate to where you are, but it's not going to be exactly the same because you're going to have a difference in climate, difference in soil, et cetera. One of the other questions that kind of had come in was, let's see here, it was in relation to ground cover.
Oh, the best ground cover to use in the pathways that won't let the grass grow in. That's kind of tricky because a lot of weeds are still going to come up through ground covers. But if you're, and as far as low maintenance in pathways, that's going to be hard. I think the sunshine mimosa could be okay, but it's going to be hard. You're going to have to trim around the edges and stuff like
yeah, because it'll link
perennial peanut.
Yeah,
but you can walk on the mimosa. You walk on perennial peanut, but not as much. You also have fog fruit, the matchstick weed, Phyllonotiflora. Yeah, it's going to be a little bit hard. They're not going to fill in as good. I think the Phyllonotiflora might be one of the better ones, the matchstick weed. But yeah, you're always still going to have some amount of maintenance. That's why I myself would probably use a mulch in between in my pathways, but just depending.
And there some of the gardens, if they're up for the effort with the mulch, some of the gardens that have the mulched paths, some of the more enthusiastic gardeners will actually go through, once that mulch is breaking down enough that they're getting quite a bit of weed that's wanting to pop through because it's basically broken down into a soil medium at that point. They'll take off that top cover of the mulch and they'll dig out and get really nice soil and put it in their pot, and then they'll replenish the mulch in the path. So it requires, labor, but you just got some nice soil.
And that kind of answers the next question: is rock or mulch better? I prefer mulch because it's a natural well, rocks are natural too, but it eventually breaks down and you do get good soil, and it's easier to walk on mulch than it is rock. And rocks can eventually sink down into the soil, so you'd have to replenish them. And this way, if you're replenishing the mulch, you can, it adds into your soil. So you got to think about things like that. So more on the fertilizing here, stimulating excessive growth and diminished fruiting. It aggravates pest problems, and that is shown in the top picture there. You can really get pests coming in badly if you're over fertilizing. And sometimes you just get all green growth and no fruit at all. So it depends on what the plant is, but and it requires more watering, because you don't want to burn the plants because of the fertilizer, and then it can run off into the nearest body of water and seep into the aquifer, and basically it's wasting money. And I'm a big one for not fertilizing. In this bottom picture, okay, I'm telling on myself again. It's funny, this lettuce growing in the front, that grew for a long time, and then finally the rabbits found it and it was completely gone in 2 days. Okay, this was this past year where I didn't have as much room because all the trees and everything had grown up in the background. So I extended, I have a little bit of lawn. My mom made me leave a little bit, but then I keep taking up a little more space. So I used these pots with a really good potting soil that had fertilizer in it. So I didn't have to fertilize. But over here on the very end, these plants were planted at the same time. This is broccoli, and they were planted at the same time as this broccoli over here. And this was old soil that I hadn't fertilized. So you can see how important fertilizer is. If you don't fertilize at all and you don't have any nutrients in the soil, your plants just plain aren't going to grow. So it really is important to add that fertilizer, but not over fertilizing. There was just the right amount in these pots over here that I didn't have to fertilize at all, but I should have added a little bit to that pot. And it's the same thing in the ground. If your soil's been used over and over, and you don't have any fertilizer or nutrients getting to those plants, they're going to grow a little bit because that's what plants do, but they won't fully develop and fruit for you. So over fertilizing and under fertilizing can both be a detriment. Okay, so Mindy, can you explain these again?
Sure. So this is actually taken from one of our recorded presentations that's available on our YouTube channel from our former agriculture agent. And she talks about fertilization. And so basically, depending on what it is and how it grows, there's some general rules of thumb you can apply as to when you would fertilize. And then there's things like, crop rotation, et cetera. So it's not to say it's always a sure thing, but just a general, that if it's like a one planting, single harvest of a leafy green. So say you were planting some bok choy, then you would just fertilize when you were planting. If you're going back and harvesting multiple times, so you're trying to keep that plant going over time, say if there's like Swiss chard and collards and things like that, you might be fertilizing when you're planting in a few weeks after the first harvest. And then on the lower left, the root crops, you may be doing it 1 or 2 times, depending on what it is and how long it's in there. So you might be doing it when you're planting. For some of the plants that are there a little bit longer, you might be doing it when you're planting and then about a month later, whereas your radish, you might have already pulled and eaten your radish. And then for like heads of things like broccoli, et cetera, you might actually be fertilizing 2 to 3 times. And so say, for example, because some broccoli, you can harvest the head and then you have those little side shoots. So maybe you're keeping it for months at a time. So it depends on how long you have the veggie growing, and also I would say, like, what was the status of the plot when you planted your vegetables? Like if you have really nice soil going, and you're doing some crop rotation, you might not have to be overly intensive about it. But vegetables do pull nutrients from the soil, so you don't want to completely ignore them.
Okay, so mulching, number 4, the fourth principle, it buffers the soil temperature so it keeps getting too hot. It can also protect against cold if you're having root crops. It really helps inhibit weed germination. It's not going to get rid of weeds entirely, but it makes a huge difference. And you don't want to mulch over seeds, though. If you're planting seeds, they need, a lot of times they need the light, and they just can't, if you mulch over them, it's just too heavy on them, and they can't germinate through the mulch. It protects plants from mechanical damage if it's around trees and stuff. Not so much in the garden, because you shouldn't be, well, you might be hoeing, so it might be mechanical damage there too. It can add nutrients to the soil as it breaks down, but also one thing, it can also take nutrients from the soil a little bit. As it breaks down, that uses nitrogen. So if you have a lot of like pine bark and part of it's dug into the soil, you have to take into account that. One time I used a lot of potting soil that had a lot of pine bark in it. And those plants needed fertilizer a lot sooner than some of my other plants. So think about that. And it also helps reduce soil-borne diseases by keeping the plants clean, which, you know, as it's raining or you're watering and you're splashing soil up onto the plants, sometimes there's diseases in there, and that's not going to happen to those kinds of plants. In this bottom picture, and the type of mulch isn't really as important. This bottom picture, there was 2 different kinds of mulch here. Somebody had given me some pine needles, so I used that on one area, and then in another area I had just like melaleuca mulch. So it depends on what's available, the cost, what you like, all those kinds of things. It's not too important what kind you use, but it does help, especially with the weeds and the temperature. So you want to replenish it as needed. Usually you're harvesting your crop, and then you may not need it right away again, but just if you need it, mainly for landscape purposes, you're going to replenish it as needed. Organic mulches, leaves, hay, straw, pine needles, moss for mulch, all on tender vegetables especially works well. Don't use cypress mulch, it's not sustainable. Usually you want to maintain a 2 to 3 inch layer of mulch after it settles. You do need to keep it away from the base of the plants and tree trunks in your landscape, any plants, because if it's too close, it can hold in moisture too much and cause some rotting and things like that. So that's important, especially on vegetables. You got to move it out just a little bit. Okay, number 5, attracting wildlife. The importance of creating habitats. As we showed in that picture way back in the beginning, the urban areas rapidly increasing and less land, and developed areas, they do have an impact on the environment, and the local plant and animal communities are really, really affected just by the amount of rabbits in my yard. I think all my neighbors don't have any plants in their yards. They maybe have 1 or 2 trees and nothing else. So I have everything in my yard, and the rabbits love it. And I don't plant particularly for them, and I do get mad at them sometimes, but they're kind of cute to watch too. So, but creating habitats in general is really important. But in your gardens, you want some pollinating plants that pollinators can come, because you need them to go also to your vegetables sometimes. So thinking about that and keeping those in there, limiting the amount of lawn, and that's speaking more to landscapes, not vegetable gardens, but it'd be important to have some blooming plants around your vegetable gardens, and planting a variety of plants in varying heights to create layers for shelter. you know, having a canopy and a understory and then the mid layer. Diverse areas are going to attract a wider variety of animals. So that's all important. And that's just, I don't ever use insecticides in my yard unless I'm getting rid of some ants or some wasps, because I don't like getting bitten. But otherwise, everything is there, and I get a lot of different varieties of insects and butterflies, and yeah, some pests, but not too much. And usually the pests are taken care of by the beneficial insects, so that's important. So you're wanting to attract, for especially for a garden, birds and bees and bats, butterflies, beetles, maybe not so much frogs and toads, but they help eliminate some of the pest insects. Snakes can eliminate rats and mice and things like that. You want some shelter for some of the insects and snakes. If you don't like snakes, this part of it, you just close your ears. But again, planting that layered and diverse palette of plants, the layers especially important, and then avoiding pesticides. That's super important for, especially for an edible garden. You don't want to be using any kind of pesticide in there because then it's on your food. Mindy, can you explain the middle picture?
The lower middle picture was
Right.
Was from lack of pollination, and so there's quite a bit of what you want to grow where the amount of what you get or what you can harvest is going to rely on some pollination, and so it's good to have a variety of plants. And there's things that you can plant that are edible for you and also beneficial for pollinators, things like borage and
Basil.
sunflowers and a few different things.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, and usually our community gardens are pretty good about trying to please the pollinators, which is nice. So and then there's a few different things that had kind of come in, and I did want to really briefly mention when talking about cover crop and ground cover. So when some of the folks were talking about ground cover and suggestions, one of the things you do want to consider if you're walking on that space is it going to be a trip hazard? Like, is it a vining ground cover? Because, so in other words, what I might say is an edible that somebody could plant in a plot, like sweet potato and watermelon and whatever else that's going to kind of fill out that plot, might not be the best thing to have in a path. So same thing with with some of the jasmines and things. It's whether you're covering your ground or you're also trying to use it as a walkway. So you just don't want to trip yourself. Same thing when somebody was mentioning about rock. Better for like a pathway than actually mulching. I'm not a big rock fan when it comes to.
Yeah, it's still mulch. Not as easy to walk on.
Definitely not for edible.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it can also impact your pH and stuff too sometimes. So
and somebody else does a soil amendment count as a first fertilization when planting? It could. It depends on what the soil amendment is. Sometimes there's nutrients in it. Some of the compost has nutrients. So it kind of just depends on what it is. Sometimes I let it count, and sometimes I realize you can usually tell by how fast the plant starts. If it's starting really slow and the color's off, then it usually needs some fertilizer too. But if it's starting really fast, if it was a good compost, it'll have some nutrients that it could count.
Yeah, and also what you're growing too. Like a tomato is going to be a little bit different than a little bok choy. So it depends, like Wilma said. And then, one other thing, and then there's cover crops that can be taller than, I'm like 5'4". So there's cover crops that are taller than me. So some that you might consider could be potentially like a temporary ground cover, if you will. But there's also plenty that are going to be quite large, like sun hemp can get big. So the two terms, ground cover and cover crop, aren't necessarily interchangeable. It's just sometimes you might have an overlap of what you're looking for versatility.
Okay, so when managing landscape pests responsibly, some of them, like the squirrel, there's just not a whole lot of managing. That is not from my yard. There was a question there. He's on a fence. And unfortunately, in this yard, I was on a site visit, and they would grab a mango off of the tree because the fence went underneath the tree. And if they dropped it, I mean, he was almost standing on his front feet. It was so heavy for him. And if they dropped it, they just went and grabbed another one. At my house, I've noticed if they've got a mango that they've captured, or whoever's eating it, I'm assuming it's squirrels, it could be something else, but they actually end up eating the whole thing, and usually nearby the tree. I don't find seeds. Otherwise, I'll find some underneath the tree, but yeah, squirrels love mangoes. But you do need to set realistic expectations. It's not practical to have an insect-free or a weed-free or disease-free landscape. Same in your garden. You obviously can't let too many weeds or insects or disease in there. But a lot of times one insect will take care of other insects. And if you're, well, you like I said, you don't want sprays in your garden anyways, but like these insects here in the top picture, those are Harlequin bugs. And I could have gone in there and just picked that leaf off, bagged it up, and then every single one of those would have been gone. They wouldn't have even had a chance to hatch out, because I do check my leaves for bugs and things like that. And something like that, you see those eggs, they're big enough to see, you just pick them out. And these insects get several times larger than this. And so as they get bigger, you're going to see them too. I like capturing pictures of things. So sometimes, I think it was after harvest, this was on a cabbage plant, and I had already harvested the cabbage. So I just let them go so I could get pictures of all the different stages. But you generally wouldn't do that in your yard. You would want to pick them off and get rid of them. But if you see one or two insects that are eating a caterpillar that's eating a little bit of your plant, you can pick that caterpillar off. Things like that. And one or two, a little bit of damage isn't going to hurt. If there's more and there's a lot of damage, yeah, you need to really be in there looking and finding that and getting rid of it. But
and I think we have some more slides of those coming up.
Coordinated IPM, integrated pest management, is coordinated use of pest and environmental information and the available pest control methods. So there are some kinds of insecticides that you can use that aren't so damaging, and they're like soaps and biological controls and things like that. So you want to research what's available for what you have. And if it's not something you can pick off, obviously a disease you can't always pick off. Sometimes you can pick a leaf off and maybe, but not always. Like right now, I noticed my mango has rust. That's not something, I picked a lot of them off, but I can't pick every single leaf off of the tree. So I may have to spray with a copper or something like that, but there's no mangoes on it. So now would be a good time to do that. And chickens love all of the bugs. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have chickens, but that is an option for a lot of people. So that's something to think about too. But you always want to be out in your yard, looking at your garden, checking for signs of problems. Check them, maybe not daily, but once or twice a week is ideal. So look for physical, biological, and chemical treatments. First you want to use the physical, then the biological, and at last resort is chemical. And then you're going to start with the least toxic methods and know what the beneficial insects are. Ladybug larvae look like a lot of people think they're a pest, and I've known people to spray them before. You got to know what is in your yard, and then obviously treat. A lot of times I'll just let something go. If I see ladybugs, I let them go and they will take care of the other problem. This is not an edible plant here. This is milkweed, but it just shows how bad an insect can get on there. But there's ladybugs on here, and there was another beneficial insect on there. I can't remember what it was, but they completely wiped out the aphids. So let the beneficial insects do the work for you. This top picture obviously is a ladybug eating an aphid. This is an immature assassin bug, and they eat a lot of insects. They're fun to watch too. This is the ladybug larva, and they're a mean eating machine. That one right there is eating an aphid. Then they just love the aphids. They eat them. This was a landscape plant, but this is Oleander Scale, and Oleander Scale can kill a plant. You don't think of scales usually as killing a plant, but just causing harm on a plant, but they actually can kill a plant. This one happened to be on firebush, but Croton scale can harm a number of plants. And this plant was looking pretty sickly for a while, but then I had beneficial insects, wasps, parasitizing. You see these little holes? Those are where wasps came out of those holes. They had been parasitized by a wasp, and then it was a larva inside of that, and then it came out, and then and all these brown ones are already dead. There's only 1 or 2 live scale on here, and eventually they all just disappeared. And then this other picture is a wasp parasitizing aphids. And talking about physical control, I started to cut all the tips off of this plant, and then I saw this wasp parasitizing. I said, well, I'm just going to leave it alone. And within a couple of weeks, every single aphid was gone off of that plant. So that's what I mean by knowing what beneficial insects are. And if you're seeing them, or if you can tolerate some damage on the plant, let them take its course. Because after a year or 2 of not using any insecticides, you have all these beneficial insects come in and take care of themselves. And spiders, they kill a lot of insects, so they're really good. That's green link spider there, green lacewing down here, and then of course praying mantis, if you're lucky enough to get those in your yard. They kill a lot of insects, and they're fun to watch. Bunny proofing tactics. This is funny. I just actually put up some chicken wire around a couple of my plants in my yard because, like I said, I have bunny rabbits that I feed in my yard. But sometimes you can interplant with plants that they don't like, the onions and the leeks and the things like that. But other times they just love certain plants. But it's funny, I had broccoli plants in my yard. That's what this bottom picture is. Last year I had a couple of broccoli plants, and they were so good. They were the best broccoli I've ever had in my life, and they hadn't even touched them. So I went to the store and I got some more broccoli, and they ate every single one of them. And I use these forks. That's what is there. But you have to put them out far enough that they can't climb over or find spaces in between. And generally I did a pretty good job of putting the forks down, but then you have to make sure you pick them up so the plastic's not breaking all over the place and everything. So this year I invested in some chicken wire, and that's working. But
and then the other picture is, it's that malleable plastic that's relatively small gauge, and it's just kind of cut in a rectangle and then folded into like a cylindrical shape, and just like a skewer put through it, just over the young plants, because they seem to, and then it gets removed, just because they have a tendency to like those young tender leaves.
The tender,
some of the
yeah.
plants,
Once they get big,
they're like, meh. And that's a really economical, easy solution. And then I've also seen sometimes where people, if they did a row crop and then they kind of folded over some small gauge fencing over that small row until it got a little bit bigger. But I wouldn't use the netting. Sometimes people they're trying to keep deer away from things, and they put a certain kind of netting out. And I've unfortunately heard and or seen multiple times where people have done that in their home to try to save their shrubs from the deer, and they caught black racer snakes, and the black racers get tangled in it and die. And so that's, and it's easily avoidable by using different materials. You don't need to use that netting around your vegetables.
So some of the cultural practices to help maintain your healthy plants. stress plants are more susceptible to attack. So keep, if something needs fertilizing, fertilize it, don't over fertilize it. Putting the right plant in the right place where it's getting the right light and all that kind of stuff. Proper irrigation, proper fertilizer, correct installation and correct maintenance, and crop rotation. Don't put the same plant in the same place every single year, because then those pests that are attracted to that plant are already going to be in the soil or nearby, and you're more apt to have attacks on those plants. If you're putting new plants in different places every year, you're a lot less chance of having insects already there ready to attack them. And Mindy, do you want to explain this picture?
Every once in a while, you kind of have in one of the community gardens, you have people that like they come and they plant and they forget afterwards. And so it's just a matter of like, weeding, spacing, things of that nature. And sometimes people find it annoying the amount of time that I'll talk about weeding, but they can vector, diseases, host pests and disease that can be carried over to your edible plants. So especially during our summer months, you can have something that's present around in the garden and it's carried over in the weeds. And then when you go to plant again in the fall, you're having an issue because it is a challenge to keep up with, but there's reasons why you want to do it.
Okay, and then some physical methods. You can remove pests by hand. Caterpillars aren't going to bite you. They don't hurt. Very few stinging caterpillars, but there are 5 in Florida that you do need to watch out for. These were ones on cabbage that turn into really pretty butterflies, but most of the times you don't want them eating your cabbage. These were some that had already been harvested and I was hatching the butterflies, but you can remove them by hand if there gets to be too many. Remove the infested parts of the plant if it's a disease. And that doesn't work for every disease, but it can help with some of them. Establish barriers to prevent pest access to plants, and that was some of the netting, and not the netting, but the fencing and things like that. And other kinds of crops, well, even in vegetable gardens, but this is more usually indoors, yellow sticky paper is going to attract whiteflies, but sometimes you can use that to see if you have a problem in your yard. But generally, if you have a problem, you're going to know it ahead of time. But and other problems, mostly this isn't actually a problem in vegetable gardens, but just knocking the little lubber, these are lubber grasshoppers, and they can do a lot of damage to plants. They hatch out in the spring. So if you get them before they get big, they're still all grouped together in a bunch, and just put them in some soapy water. That's the least toxic method. You're not spraying a chemical. You're not getting anything on your plants. You're not having anything in the environment, and you've killed them within seconds. They die immediately in the water. So you're not prolonging, hurting them. I mean, you're hurting them, but you're not making them suffer. And then the last resort, if this hadn't been an already harvested plant and they were that bad on there, then you probably would need to spray, but you're going to use the least harmful. Well, actually, they're all bunched together, so you could just take them off. But if you had to use a chemical, you're going to use a selective pesticide rather than broad spectrum, not spray the whole garden. Don't have a shotgun approach where you're spraying everything. Just spray what you need to. If they're only on one plant, you only need to spray one plant. But again, like I said, it's easier to pick them off than to spray. But the most important thing, if you do have to use a pesticide of any kind, using the least toxic, but then follow the label instructions very, very carefully. It has to be labeled for that crop, and safety is vitally important when you're handling chemicals, any kind of chemical. You want the proper personal protection equipment, the proper PPE, and the label is the law. If you're applying it to a crop that's not listed, things like that, that's basically breaking the law. So number 7, we only have 6 minutes left. Recycling yard waste, any pine needles, anything like that in your yard, leaves, if you can use them in your landscape, that's better. If you can create a compost bin, that's super, because then you're able to use that later in your garden. Remove disease materials that might re-affect a plant, but you're going to save some money on fertilizer. You're using them as mulch. You're saving on waste disposal. You're helping our landfills not get filled up so fast. So that's really, really important there. Like I said, composting using those leaves and pine needles as mulch if you can, but under, you know, trees. You can even use the leaves in a garden, a vegetable garden, or use them as browns in your compost bin, and creating and maintaining a compost pile with kitchen scraps and yard waste is always a really, really good way to get rid of a lot of stuff. Leaving grass clippings on your lawn if you have a lawn, use them in the compost or leave them on the lawn. Never want to have them go down the drain. That's number one, illegal in Florida, but it causes a lot of fish kills because that's going to end up in a body of water. And as that's decomposing, it depletes oxygen, and it can make a eutrophication in the pond, which is basically killing everything in the pond. Good bacteria, bad bacteria, everything. You get a huge mess in there. And number 8, reducing stormwater runoff. Runoff is excessive water from irrigation, rain, or other sources, and you want to keep it in the landscape to percolate into the soil. So using porous walkways, patios, and driveways if possible. I know some of us already have those things, and you're not going to go out and cut it up into little pieces so it's porous. But if you're putting in anything new, keep that in mind. There are porous concretes, so bricks and mulch and porous concrete. Observe your water flow before planting, and don't use runoff to water your vegetables. Like we said earlier, that's you don't know what's in it necessarily, and it could be detrimental to your garden, but it can percolate in a swale or something like that and help reduce the runoff that goes into the storm drains. Swales, terracing can catch and hold and filter the storm water, and add organic matter to your soil so nutrients and water are better retained and they're available to your vegetables, and that's also reducing the leaching and the runoff. And if you have manure, it must be stored and used responsibly to avoid runoff. And there's an EDIS article, a UF publication there, HS 1215, and then use collected rain barrel for non-edibles, rain barrel water for non-edibles. That's something we mentioned already. And then number 9, protecting the waterfront. No one in Florida lives more than 60 miles from the water. So we're all surrounded by water. I mean, there's lakes and there's rivers and there's everything else. So 75% of Florida's population lives within 30 miles of the beach. So know your watershed, where your water goes, and don't allow runoff from your garden going into a water body. Don't fertilize near the water. Don't plant edible crops that require tilling, irrigation, or fertilization within 10 feet of the water. And plant a border of low maintenance plants along the water edge, and they're going to help absorb any nutrients that happens to come over into that area. Provide a wildlife habitat with those plants along the edge, and it encourages beneficial insects because you have plants that they can get in there, and then it's going to help prevent erosion. So that's a low maintenance buffer zone. And now there's a lot of materials, and like I said, we're sending you a list that has all this. With this Florida Friendly Landscaping book, it's not so much for edible gardening, but a lot of other. There are a lot of documents put out by UF that has the 9 principles in an edible landscaping document. Florida Agriculture in the Classroom has some good material. Florida Wildflower Foundation for attracting pollinators, vegetable gardening in Florida series, edible landscaping. So all kinds of this Growables, Grow Florida Edibles. That's an amazing website. You really, really want to look at that. A couple of master gardeners put it together, and they maintain it. They're always constantly checking links. So that's a really good website. And then there's some vegetable gardening books. Grow to Learn. This is a link that we're going to send you. You can get it online. These are some books that you would have to order, but still great, fantastic books. You can apply the Florida Friendly Landscape Principles to school gardens, community gardens, home gardens, whatever method you're using. If you're using square foot gardening, foodscaping, mixing it in with your landscaping, edible landscaping, permaculture, urban agriculture, it all works. And it's simple steps is following the principles: plant Florida friendly and native and/or edible plants and trees, conserve water and reduce fertilizer use by composting and using mulch. And there you have it.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today.